hasn't changed at all. So while they're standing beside you, won't you tell them the score? Won't you tell them a story of the days in the way back when? Every now and then.
Here is the kitchen. One way to look at our bodies is to think of them as little furnaces which take in fuel, that's our food, and break it down into energy which we burn up every minute, day and night. Different parts of our bodies need different kinds of fuel, and we take a vitamin each day to make sure our bodies get exactly what they need, just in case we don't eat the right kinds of food.
It seemed like almost every food we heard about on the radio and TV when we were little, from white bread to chocolate milk, was packed with vitamins. Vitamins and minerals promised to make us grow straight and strong, keep our teeth white and our eyes bright, and every morning at breakfast, sure as shooting, there'd be a little red vitamin pill there beside our glass of vitamin C orange juice, our fortified cereal, and our vitamin D milk. Breakfast just wasn't breakfast without it.
Now you have to understand, cod liver oil is about the worst tasting stuff on the face of the earth. Compared to cod liver oil, asparagus tastes like chocolate cake. But Mom said it was good for us. So every Sunday night, each of the kids lined up for a teaspoonful. It was amazing how something that was so good for you made you feel so bad.
Couldn't you sneak out of line?
Not with my mother, you couldn't. She was usually a step or two ahead of us. And after a while, Mom started mixing the cod liver oil into a glass of orange juice. It made it go down a little easier, but you know, I've never taken to orange juice ever since. There were tonics for whatever ailed us back when I was a girl in Lincoln's day. Some we got at the general store in town, and some from the peddler who visited every month or so. Those medicines and concoctions never did much, I don't think. Mind over matter, most of it was. But they had wonderful labels and positively magical names. Names like Dr. Miller's Kidney Tonic and Carter's Little Liver Pills. Did you ever hear the like? Why, I felt better just looking at them.
Here is the kitchen. The modern stove has burners to cook food, while in the oven other foods can be baked. This stove uses electricity for its heat, but others, the kind where you actually see the fire, burn natural gas. Back in the 50s, electric and gas stoves had made cooking meals fast and clean. We didn't have to sweep up wood ash or coal dust every day like our parents did. We got as much heat as we needed just by turning a dial.
When I was a child, the bucket-a-day coal stove was king of the kitchen. Cooking with coal wasn't much faster than with wood, but it sure was easier to keep the fire going, since coal was delivered right to my door, and nobody had to bother cutting firewood. Now, you couldn't turn a coal stove on and off. They took a while to heat up, and then you just had to let them burn out. So we kept the stove hot all day, summer and winter, and it was the job of the oldest child, that was me, to start the fire each morning for breakfast and hot water. By the time Lincoln was president, most of our houses had gotten Franklin stoves. Cooking was faster and better than over an open fire because the women could control how hot the fire became by how much air they let into the firebox. This saved them time, and it made fathers in my life easier too, because we didn't have to spend every spare minute chopping firewood.
In President Washington's day, we cooked food in a stone hearth or fireplace. Working near an open fire could be very dangerous, as our linen dresses and aprons could easily catch fire. In the summer, cooking meals was so hot that most of our farms had separate buildings called summer kitchens, so that a cooking fire wouldn't heat up the entire house.
Ben Franklin invented the stove over 200 years ago in Philadelphia. Old Ben figured that if he could put his cooking and heating fire into an iron box and move it out of the fireplace and into the room, most of the hot air would stay indoors and only the smoke would go up the chimney.
And he was right.
He sure was. Because of Franklin's stove, rooms got warmer and less drafty, and cooking food became easier and much safer.
Over the years, cooking food has become safer, faster, and easier. And it's still changing, even today.
I know, with microwaves.
Right. The old oven is giving way to computerized microwave ovens, which work by vibrating water molecules in the food, cooking it from the inside out. For many foods, this cuts preparation time from hours down to minutes, and makes cooking meals simple enough for the entire family to do.
Electricity is a kind of energy that can do two different jobs. It either does work, like turning a motor, for example, or it turns into another kind of energy called heat. Now, when mom or dad turns on the stove, electricity flows through wires beneath the range top into the burners, and it heats them up till they actually start to glow red hot. And it's that heat which cooks your food.
Here is the kitchen. Toasters work by heating the outside of bread, drying it out, and giving it a fresh-baked kind of taste. In fact, bread crust is actually just the part of the loaf which got toasted during baking. Today's electric toasters are made to toast bread, bagels, muffins, and some even have little electric ovens to heat slices of pizza and other frozen foods.
The toaster we used as kids was another modern convenience of the electric kitchen. Not only did it toast the bread, but we could control how dark it got, and it popped up automatically when it was finished. Well, sometimes it did anyway.
You know, they still haven't gotten that right.
Making toast when we were youngsters was quite a production and a little bit risky, too. The electric heating coils were out in the open, and if you touched them, you could get quite a shock. We toasted the bread one side at a time, flipping it over after the coils toasted one side. Doing it this way, a good piece of toast was hard to come by.
Our toasters were actually pieces of wrought iron bent to hold a slice of bread, and we just set them on top of the kitchen stove. We could toast both sides of the bread at once that way, but unless the stove was very hot, it took quite a bit of time.
Just like all our other cooking back in Washington's day, we toasted our bread in the fireplace, and we did it by hand. We just stuck our slice of bread on the end of a long fork and then held it over the open fire till it suited us.
That's how we toast marshmallows today, over a campfire.
Watch the electricity from the outlet flow through the toaster wire and turn the wire coils inside the toaster red hot. This is what toasts the outside of the bread. Here is the kitchen.
Preparing meals usually involves cutting, chopping, mixing, or blending our food. Now, you can sharpen your knife and do it by hand, or you can toss your ingredients into a food processor and let it do the work for you. With a food processor, you can grate stale bread into breadcrumbs, make fresh fruit juice, slice carrots, dice apples, shred lettuce, and even make bread dough in a fraction of the time it'd take to do it by hand.
Hearing the mixer start to run in our house when I was a kid usually meant cakes or cookies. We had a big metal mixer that sat on the kitchen counter, along with 2 different size mixing bowls. The 2 beaters would start to spin. They looked like propellers on a ship. And that would start the bowls spinning around, making sure all the food got mixed into the beaters. It was neat watching different colored foods get added together. Sometimes they would just blend half and half, but other times one color would just kind of disappear. That was fun. But that's not why my brother and I stayed close to the kitchen.
I know. You were really there for the
Beaters!
You know, some things never change.
Mom had an old silver hand mixer in the kitchen when I was a girl in the 20s. I used to play with it all the time, trying to figure out how it worked.
Was it electric?
No, you turn the handle. Some gears would turn, and then each beater would turn in a different direction. You had to really set the mixer flying for it to do the job right, and it was hard work. But if you didn't, your mashed potatoes be too lumpy to eat. Mashing yams or potatoes was never a job I looked forward to back in the 1860s, although being the oldest girl, that was the job I got. You put your potatoes in a bowl, add a little milk, and just start smashing and mashing down by hand. I'll tell you one thing, though. It sure got you breathing hard by the time you were through. And of course at dinner, my brothers weren't shy about calling my attention to the lumps.
The earliest mixer was a mortar and pestle. It's just a shallow clay bowl where you put something, a flower say, or maybe some leaves, and then you pounded it down with a clay grinder that looked a little like a bone until you smashed the plant up and got some of its juices or oils out. The earliest doctors and healers used to grow special plants called herbs, which they would grind down and give to their sick patients. Even today, if you look at the sign over your drugstore, chances are you'll still see the mortar and pestle. It's the symbol of the druggist, just like the red and white pole is the symbol of the barber.
I've seen that sign before. It's even on some medicine bottles in our cabinet.
The earliest mixer was a mortar. Here is the kitchen.
Why do you need faucets? Well, it's a funny thing. You don't actually need a faucet to get water out of the water pipe. You actually need them to keep the water from coming out all the time. Faucets are really just caps at the end of your water pipes, caps that you can open or close to turn the water on or off. And faucets today not only let you set how fast the water comes out, but they can also mix water from the hot water pipe and the cold water pipe to give you warm water for washing.
The faucets we had back in the 50s weren't that much different than today's kind, except that they always seemed to be leaking. Dad could pretend not to notice when they dripped a little. He could always turn the handle just a little tighter than the rest of us. But pretty soon it would drip no matter what. Then out come the toolbox and the jar of rubber washers, and Dad and I would go to work. It was a simple job, really. Unscrew the handles on the faucet stems, take out the old rubber washers, put in the new ones, put it back together, and that was it. It was the first repair job I learned how to do. I was only 8 years old, but I felt a lot older, like my family depended on me, you know?
I know. I feel that way when I help my dad mow the lawn.
When I was a girl, I could figure out how most things worked. just by looking at them. Take our well, for example. I was there when my father and older brothers dug it, boring deep into the ground, 40 feet or so, until they struck water. And whenever I went out to draw a bucket of water from the pump in our backyard, I'd see in my mind's eye how it was coming from way under our land, and I'd try and figure out why it was always the same temperature, winter or summer. Mind you, I said I could figure out most things, not everything.
I can figure it out.
All right, how does it work?
It's simple. Winter and summer doesn't mean anything 40 feet below the earth, so the water doesn't change temperature.
You're right on target. When rain falls or snow melts, any water that doesn't run off into streams or evaporate will seep into the ground until it reaches solid rock, and then it collects in an underground lake or starts flowing as an underground stream. When you drill a well, you are just digging a hole into that underground water supply, and then you can pump it up to ground level for you to use.
And that's why we shouldn't pour polluted water into the ground, because if it mixes with fresh water underground, then all the water will be polluted.
That's right. Here is the kitchen.
Today's irons make short work of getting the wrinkles out of clothes. Of course, the clothes themselves do half the work, since most of them are permanent press and don't wrinkle much in the first place. Electric irons heat up in much the same way as the electric stove does. But when you pour water into it, the heat boils the water and the steam sort of relaxes the wrinkles in clothes, making them easier to iron.
Just the way wetting your hair makes it easier to comb.
The electric iron that Mom used when I was a kid helped make a long, boring job a little bit easier for her to take. 2 afternoons a week, right after lunch, Mom would set up the ironing board and plug in the iron by the radio or in front of the TV set to help her pass the time. And believe me, ironing took a lot of time. Shirts, pants, blouses, and dresses came off the clothesline a mass of wrinkles, and the hot iron alone couldn't smooth them out. Mom used a Pepsi bottle with a little sprinkler top to dampen the clothes before she ironed them, and dress shirts and collars of dresses had to be starched as well, so they wouldn't wrinkle 5 minutes after you put them on.
The irons that my mother used in the 20s weren't at all like the lightweight models used today. No, sir. They were called irons because that's what they were, made of iron and weighing about 10 pounds each. Hefting an iron all day long was real work. It left aches in your muscles that you never thought would go away.
How did your mother get the irons hot?
Well, Mom set up the ironing by the wood stove in the kitchen. She had 2 irons that she heated up on the stove. She'd use one till it cooled down and then set it back on the stovetop, switch the handle to the other iron, and work that one a while. And she had to pay attention, too. If she left the iron too long on the hot stove, it could burn a hole right through the shirt or pair of trousers that she was ironing. And then, look out!
In the old days, ironing clothes took up an entire day, once a week. But today, new ways of making wrinkle-free clothes and steam irons and clothes dryers make ironing a job that takes up maybe half an hour every couple of days or so, if that. And it's not hard to imagine that by the time today's kids grow up, ironing will be a thing of the past, and they'll have to explain to their own children what an iron looked like and what it did. Here is the kitchen.
There's no limit to what we'll do to get a good cup of coffee in the mornings, and no end to the gadgets that we'll buy to make it either. For example, today's coffee makers actually have built-in clocks. You put the coffee and the water in the night before, and set the clock for about 10 minutes before you wake up in the morning. Then, right on schedule, the water heats to a boil, drips down over the coffee, and the smell of fresh brewed coffee wakes you up.
It's like an alarm clock for your nose.
It was a mystery watching the big electric coffee pot that stood on our kitchen counter go about its job. It was a solid plastic of some sort, except on top of the lid where there was a clear glass handle that looked like a flat bubble. Mom filled the pot partway with clear water and put a couple tablespoons of ground coffee into a basket that stayed near the top. And when she plugged it in, the water would start to hiss and boil and shoot up to the top of the pot, where we could see it pop against the glass bubble and drip back down. The first couple of bubbles were clear, but after it dripped back down through the coffee a few times, it started turning a darker and darker brown. It was percolating, Mom said. It smelled good and sounded funny and was neat to watch, but it sure didn't taste very good, at least to me.
That old saying about wood, that it warms you twice, once when you're cutting it, and once again when you put it into the stove. And that's how it was with coffee when I was a kid. I got to enjoy it twice, once at the store and once again at home. About twice a week or so, Mom would send me to the grocer's for a half-pound of coffee, a pound if we had the money. The roasted coffee beans were kept in a wooden bin with a glass top. They smelled good, kind of bitter but rich when you scooped them out. Then when you spilled them into the big iron coffee grinder and started turning that handle, that warm, dark smell just sent you to heaven. And it was almost as good the second time around, smelling the first pot that Mom put on for Pop on a brisk Saturday morning before he left for work.
Coffee was available back in Washington's day, but in my family we drank tea. You see, we'd come over from England not long before and brought our tea-drinking habits with us. In fact, you could almost say that tea helped make a nation out of us.
How could that be?
No, because when Sam Adams and his Sons of Liberty held the Boston Tea Party, dumping all that tea into Boston Harbor rather than paying taxes on it, he helped send the colonies down the road to independence.
Most coffee beans today are picked from bushes that grow in South America. But we first picked up the habit from Turkish soldiers who invaded Europe over 300 years ago. That's how it is with war sometimes. Not only do armies clash, but different cultures mix also, with each leaving habits, ideas, and inventions behind when they leave.
Here is the kitchen. Some foods like meat, fish, dairy products, fresh fruits, and vegetables will soon start to go bad if they are kept in a warm place.
That's why you need refrigerators.
Right. Refrigerators are like little cold rooms in your kitchen. They let you keep food fresh and healthful for many days at a time, even when it is hot outside. Freezers are even colder. They freeze the water that is in the food and keep the food from turning bad for weeks or even months at a time. Back in the 1950s, when we were kids, just about every home had a fridge. They were noisy and broke down a lot and didn't hold very much food, the freezer compartments especially. But then again, we didn't buy a lot of packaged and frozen foods either. But because refrigerators let us store more food in our own kitchens for longer periods of time, a new kind of food store started appearing in our neighborhoods, the supermarket, where we could buy every different kind of food.
You mean there were no supermarkets when you were small?
Nope, just corner groceries.
When we were little, even homes that had electricity only used it for lights. We kept our meat, fruit, and vegetables cool in ice boxes. The iceman would come down the street each day and sell us 50 or 100-pound cakes of ice. He'd put the ice in the top door of the ice box, where the cool air would drop down onto the food stored below as the ice melted during the day.
What did the iceman do in the winter? You didn't need ice then.
Oh, he still made his rounds, but he delivered coal or firewood for the Franklin stove instead.
In the days before electricity, women folk did the best we could to keep our food from spoiling. Our farm, for example, had a spring house. It was a little stone house built right over the spot where a stream flowed out from the ground. The water in this little stream was cool enough to keep jars of milk, eggs, and meats fresh for a day or two. But you had to be careful when you went to the spring house. Lots of snakes and critters liked the cool darkness, too. When blocks of ice became available, the refrigerator moved indoors from the spring house right into the kitchen where the food is prepared. And since then, refrigerating food has become very simple, thanks to the electric motor. In the last 60 years, refrigerator freezers have gotten bigger and better. But we now know at quite a cost to the environment. The chemical refrigerant used in modern refrigerators, it turns out, is helping destroy the protective layer of ozone which surrounds our planet. And because of this, refrigerators will surely change again, and in the very near future.
When you put an ice cube in a glass of water, it makes it a lot colder than if you just pour the same amount of freezing water into it. That's because it takes a lot of heat or energy to change the ice into liquid. And when the heat leaves the water to help melt the ice, the water gets colder. A refrigerator works just the same way, but instead of changing solid ice to liquid water, it changes something called a refrigerant from a liquid to a gas. Now, where does the heat come from to change the liquid refrigerant into a gas? From the food. And what happens when the heat leaves the food?
It gets colder.
Here is the kitchen. All of the food we eat starts out life either as a plant or as some kind of animal. Take breakfast, for instance. Milk comes from
A cow.
bacon from,
A pig,
oranges from,
A tree.
eggs from,
a chicken,
corn for your cornflakes from,
a cornstalk,
coffee from a bush. You name it, it's either plant or animal. Then how come our food doesn't look that way on our table? Probably because so many things happen to it between the field where it grew and the table where it's eaten. See, most of us don't live on farms anymore. So to us, the first we see food is when it comes home from the supermarket, packaged in boxes or wrapped in cellophane. Just heat and serve.
Nowadays, you can get any kind of food almost any time of year. But back in the 50s, things were different. There wasn't as much frozen food when I was a boy, so you had to wait till foods were in season before you could get them.
What does in season mean?
It means waiting until the farmer picked his crop and brought it to market. But boy, was it ever worth it. In the summer, right about the time the first peaches ripened, the local dairy started making peach ice cream with bits of fresh peach all through it. To this day, peach ice cream makes me think of warm July evenings 30 or 35 years ago. Seems like yesterday.
I lived in the city as a kid in the 20s, but I knew pretty much about farms anyway. You see, food wouldn't keep in our ice boxes very long, especially in summer. So I wound up going to the store every day to buy our food fresh. I'd go to the greengrocers for lettuce, cabbage, or peas, still in the shell, mind you, whatever was in season. And as I got older, I'd even pick out a nice chicken or a good piece of liver for supper. And the hucksters that drove their wagons down our streets straight off the farm, they'd shout out whatever they had. You could hear 'em for blocks. Asparagus early in the spring, peas a little later. But when the strawberries ripened in June, that's one errand we didn't mind running.
Those of us who lived in town back in Lincoln's day got our food from big open-air markets, called farmers' markets, that were set up on open ground in the market square. Of course, you got your staples, flour, molasses, rice, and so forth. from the general store, but in-season fruits and vegetables were in the stalls, and chickens and smoked hams and sides of beef hung on hooks in the open air for us to take home for the families. Now, fresh food like this wouldn't keep forever, especially through a long winter, so we dried all the water out of it and ate lots of hardtack and beef jerky and dried fruit whenever we couldn't get fresh.
It's hard to believe nowadays how much we looked forward to the first fruits and vegetables of spring.
How come?
Well, after eating dried beans and fruits, salt pork, and whatever all winter long, the first peas we shelled and ate fresh meant more to us than any banquet. Our gardens were as important to us as our homes, and even our founding fathers, President Jefferson, for example, were great gardeners who planted new kinds of crops each year. Tom Jefferson actually had a running bet from year to year with George Washington to see who could produce the earliest crop of spring peas.
Who won the bet?
I don't know, but my money is on Jefferson.
Here is the kitchen. Telephones are in just about every room in today's house, but they can be found most often in the kitchen. Today's computerized phones can take calls from 2 different callers at once, talk to computers at the bank or shopping center, take messages while you are out, and actually follow you around the house.
How do they do that?
You know, portable phones.
Oh yeah, that's right.
When we were kids, telephones came in one color, black, and they had dials rather than buttons. We actually shared our phone line with another family down the street. We called it a party line, and you couldn't talk on your phone if the other family was on the line, but you could hear what they were saying.
That must have been fun.
Well, remember, they could hear what you were saying, too. It could get mighty uncomfortable, especially if you knew the family you shared your party line with.
Of course, in our day, there were no telephones. We sent important messages from office to office by telegraph. Telegraph lines seemed to follow the railroads across the country, and this was the first time messages traveled across country in seconds. The Western Union men used Morse code to send out their telegrams. Each letter of the alphabet was a different set of dots and dashes.
You mean like signaling SOS when you're in danger? 3 dashes, 3 dots, 3 dashes?
Exactly. But do you know what SOS stands for?
I do. Save our ship.
Right again. Phones were scarce as hen's teeth when we were young. If you had one at all, it was in the hallway, and it had no dial. You had to ring up the operator and tell her who you wanted to talk to. More often, the grocer's or the general store's phone took care of the entire neighborhood. That's how I made some pocket money on weekends, by running from the store over to the neighbors' houses to tell them when they had a call.
Until Ben Franklin straightened things out, we could never really be sure if our letters would get where we sent them. Old Ben set up the United States Post Office, and it was one of the new government's first and most important jobs. The mail got more dependable then, but not a lot faster. It still took weeks for a letter to travel more than 100 miles or so.
Mr. Watson, come at once. I want you. Alexander Graham Bell, who in 1876 invented the telephone, sent this first phone message to his assistant, Mr. Watson, asking for help after spilling acid on his pants. Mr. Bell was never comfortable with the fame his invention brought him, and devoted much of his life to educating the deaf.
So he helped people hear each other 2 ways, not just one.
Right.
The telephone has become such a part of modern life that it is no longer considered a convenience. It's become a necessity. In the last 10 years, it has changed greatly, as first portable house phones, then car phones, and now personal carry-around phones have entered our lives. And although the phone has made our lives much easier over the years, it has interrupted the privacy of our homes, and many people are starting to use answering machines to screen their calls.
I know, especially at meal times.
Here is the kitchen.